Welcome, everybody. So good to have you here today for our fourth week in this series on relationships. And as I begin, let me give a big shout out to those of you joining us by video at our Clark Summit campus, and a big shout out to those of you joining us at our Wilkes-Barre campus as well. I hope you guys are having as much fun there as we are having here. Today we're continuing this series, and we're talking about in our relationships how we can move beyond just a string of bad dates, and how we can have somebody in our life who's more than just a roommate, and how we can find that person who potentially could be someone who would be for us a soulmate. And today, as we continue this series, I want to begin by just having you think about two phrases that I think create a lot of confusion when it comes to this process, as we navigate this process of dating and romance and marriage. And the two phrases are these: falling in love and staying in love. See, falling in love and staying in love, those are two very, very different things. In fact, let me just point out some of the differences between falling in love and staying in love. First of all, I think falling in love has never been easier. You know, with social media and all of the online dating services, it has never been easier to find someone to fall in love with. In fact, there are more than 500 organizations that will help you find that person that you could spend the rest of your life with. And so what you do is you pay them a fee and you create a profile for yourself using an old picture. And then they try to find somebody else who matches your profile. And you know, because of technology, the field of people that we can meet is broader than it's ever been. So falling in love has never been easier, but I would suggest this: staying in love has never been more difficult because of all the influences around us every day that work against healthy relationships. Let me tell you a second difference between these two things. Falling in love is thrilling, right? There's excitement, there's romance, there's passion, and it's so much fun to fall in love. You meet this person who's so much different than you, and it's so intriguing, and you start saying crazy things to them like, "I hope you know CPR because you take my breath away." You know, and "Honey, are you a parking ticket because you got fine written all over you?" Yeah. You know, life without you is like a broken pencil. There's just no point to it anymore. You guys aren't writing these things down. I mean, these are good. I mean, when you're falling in love, everything's great and that person is awesome and it's so thrilling. But I would suggest this to you, that staying in love is fulfilling. And I think deep down inside, as much as we love the thrill of falling in love, what we really want in life, I think because God has put it in our hearts, what we really want is not just to fall in love with a series of people, but to stay in love with someone to be on the journey with us, somebody to do life with, somebody to grow old with. Falling in love is thrilling. Staying in love, that's fulfilling. But here's a third difference. Falling in love requires a pulse. In other words, it doesn't take a lot to fall in love. All you got to do is be breathing, and the emotions and the hormones will kick in. I mean, people fall in love with celebrities and movie stars they've never met. Falling in love just requires a pulse. But staying in love, that requires a plan. That takes effort. It takes wisdom. It takes humility. You've got to make investments in that relationship. You've got to be intentional about it. Or let me say this one a little bit differently. Falling in love makes you feel something. Staying in love requires you to do something. And today, we want to talk about what it takes to stay in love. Because anybody can fall in love, but staying in love, that requires you to do some things. And today, I'm going to be speaking a lot to those of you who are married, but if you're not married, don't tune me out, because really what we're talking about are principles that apply to so many different relationships. And as I've said almost every week, there are no such things as marriage problems. There are only people problems that get magnified in marriage. And so we're going to talk about some principles today that really apply to many relationships, but I'll talk mostly to those of us who are married. And the truth is, we could spend the next 6 months talking about what it takes to stay in love. I mean, there are entire books written on how to have a healthy marriage and how to stay in love. But for the sake of time, we're just going to focus on one idea that is so foundational, one idea that's really, really big, really, really important. And then toward the end of our time, I'm going to take this idea and turn it into a question. And I want you to leave here today with a question that you can ask. And if you're willing to ask this question, it will revolutionize your relationships, not just marriage, but every relationship. But before I get to the question, let me give you the principle behind the question. Here's what it takes, not just to fall in love, but to stay in love. Here it is. The way to stay in love is to make love, pause, a verb. The way to stay in love is to make love a verb. And here's what I mean by that. Most of the time when we think of love, we often put it in the category of a noun. I mean, think about some of the phrases that we use. We say, I fell in love. It was love at first sight. Love is in the air. Or for all the fans of Frozen, love is an open door. And we think of love as this thing. It's this thing that we fall into like a swimming pool. We fall out of it like a high chair. It just kind of comes over us, and then it eventually goes away. Love is just kind of a noun. But if you want to stay in love, your love needs to be a verb. In other words, it's the kind of love where you don't just feel something. You actually do something. And as we think about this idea, I want to draw your attention to the words of Jesus in John chapter 13. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. You can bring it up on your Bible app, or you can just follow along on the side screens. But the Gospel of John, it's one of 4 biographies of the life of Jesus. And here in chapter 13, John describes the events that took place in one evening on the night before Jesus went to that cross and he was crucified. And here's how it begins. Verse 1, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. He would go to a cross, leave behind an empty tomb. Then this sentence, I love this sentence. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. His disciples, his friends, his followers, they were coming to the end of his time with them before he would go to this cross. And at the very end of his time, he showed them his love in a profound way and taught them a powerful, powerful lesson about what love really is. So here's what he does. Verse 2, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, in case you're not familiar with this story or that culture, let me tell you what was happening here. In those days, there was no such thing as concrete or asphalt. All the roads were basically dirt trails. When it rained, they turned into mud trails. And livestock used the same roads as people did, and so the roads would often be covered with droppings from animals and urine from animals, and that's what you would walk on. And the footwear of that day was an open-toed sandal. So you can only imagine what your feet looked like and what they smelled like by the time you got to your destination. And so foot washing was a very, very important custom in that day and in that culture. And so what would happen is a servant would be typically waiting by the door to wash the feet of people as they arrived in a home. But remember, this was a private gathering in a borrowed room, and so there was no servant there to wash anyone's feet. And so Jesus did what no one else in the room was willing to do. He took upon himself the job of a servant. He wrapped himself in a towel, knelt down at the feet of his disciples, and he washed their feet. It was humiliating. It was dirty. It was unpleasant. And it wasn't just the dirt of their feet. It was also what was in their hearts. I mean, think about this. Jesus washed the feet of Judas, the one who, in a matter of minutes, or at best a matter of hours, would sell him out to the religious authorities for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus washed his feet. Jesus washed the feet of Peter, the one who would deny even knowing him before the next morning. Jesus washed the feet of Thomas, the one who would totally doubt the resurrection a few days later. And he washed the feet of all the other disciples who, when Jesus was arrested that night, would flee and desert him in his hour of greatest need. But even knowing all that, he loved them. He knelt down before them. In a great humility, he washed their feet. Now, this wasn't just about a custom. This wasn't just about personal hygiene. He was teaching them a lesson about what love in the kingdom of God really looks like and the kind of love that all of us need in our relationships. And before they leave that upper room that night, Before they exit that place, as he makes his way to a garden and then to a cross, one of the last things he says to them is this in verse 34. He says, "A new command I give you, love one another." But he doesn't just leave it there. He defines it. And he takes it out of the realm of feeling, out of the realm of emotion, and he puts it into the realm of action. He says, "As I have loved you," just now, I washed your feet. I did the job of a servant. I submitted myself to you. "As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Jesus says, here's how I want you to love. I want you to love with a love that's not just a noun, it's a verb. A love that humbles itself. A love that gets its hands dirty. A love that is willing to do the job of a servant. A love that is willing to put somebody else's agenda and somebody else's need ahead of your own. And that's what it takes, my friends, to not just fall in love, but to stay in love, especially in marriage. You got to love this way, Jesus says, "As I have loved you." That's the way you love one another. Now, please understand this. This kind of love that Jesus here modeled and the kind of love that he is describing, this is so unnatural to us. It's the opposite of what comes naturally to us, because what comes naturally to us is to put ourselves first. What comes naturally to us is to serve ourselves. What comes most naturally to us is to put our agenda ahead of anyone else's agenda. And when things don't go our way, when circumstances don't go our way, when people don't cooperate with us, we can get a little bit upset. Because that's the way we're born as broken, sinful human beings. We come into this world with a bent toward selfishness. And you can even see that in little kids, can't you? I came across a website this past week. The website is called reasonmysoniscrying.com. And a father of two little boys created this website a few years ago. And it went viral. And what happens now is that parents will post pictures of their kids, of their toddlers who are having a meltdown. And then what they'll do is they'll put a caption next to it describing the reason for the meltdown. They're kind of humorous. Here's a few. I'll show you this first one. "The T-Rex jaw is not big enough to bite his Lego man's head." I mean, what kind of world are we living in when that can happen? Here's the second one. "I wouldn't let her play with a bag of dog poop." Come on, Mom, loosen up. These helicopter parents, come on. I like this one. You got this little kid here. "The dog was in the way while he was trying to push the chair." I mean, life is not worth living if you can't push the chair. And I love the dog. The dog doesn't even, he's like, whatever, it's that kid again. It's probably my personal favorite one right here. "We said she couldn't have any more bacon." Like, that'd be me right there. I mean, that's real right there. Now, I'd like to think that we all eventually grow out of that we become grown-ups and all of our self-centeredness and all of our selfishness goes away. But see, we don't grow out of our selfishness. We just learn to hide it better. And do you know where it surfaces most often? In the relationships that we have with the people who are closest to us. And so we get married, and the reason that it's so easy to fall in love and it's so hard to stay in love is because over time, the emotion begins to fade and our hearts drift towards selfishness. And we give a little less, and we expect a little more. And when they don't meet our expectations, when they don't fulfill what we think are our needs, we begin to control, we begin to demand, we have kind of a marital meltdown. And Jesus says, no, that's not love as a verb. Because if you love as a verb, here's how it looks. I want you to love one another the way I have loved you, with a love that submits, with a love that serves. So a few years go by, and the Apostle Paul takes this same idea, and he writes about it, but he changes the wording just a little bit, and he writes about it in a letter to a church in the city of Ephesus, a book of the Bible that we know today as Ephesians. It's a letter to Christians in the first century. And in chapter 5, verse 21, he gives this incredible principle in this whole section in chapter 5, 13 verses. It's all about marriage. It's all about relationships between husbands and wives. But before Paul writes anything, says anything about the specific duties of a husband or a wife, before he says anything specifically about what each one is to do in marriage, he gives this big overarching principle. Here's what he says. He says, submit to one another. Submit to one another. Do you know what that means, to submit? It means to make the wishes and the dreams and the agenda and the hopes of the other person more important than your own. It means you prioritize them over yourself. It means that you say, I'm going to serve you. By the way, every once in a while, somebody will ask me, they'll say, Mark, does the Bible say that a wife is supposed to submit to her husband? And I always say, yes, the Bible does say that. And the Bible says a husband is supposed to submit to his wife as well, because it says here, submit to one another. In fact, you keep reading, and in verse 25, it says this to husbands, specific application. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He died for the church. I don't know of any greater submission than to die for somebody. So what Paul is describing here is this principle of mutual submission. He's describing a relationship in which two people try to outserve one another, in which two people say, you know what, I want to bless you. No, I want to bless you. No, I want to put you first. No, I want to put you first. I love the way that Gerald Rogers puts it in a book that he entitled Marriage Advice I Wish I Would Have Had. He wrote this after going through divorce. And he said this, marriage is not 50-50. Divorce is 50-50. Marriage has to be 100-100. It isn't dividing everything in half, but giving everything you've got. You submit to one another. But the real kicker is in the last part of this verse. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Not out of reverence for one another, because sometimes one another doesn't make you want to have a whole lot of reverence for the other, right? And so Paul says, listen, I'm not asking you to bless them and love them and serve them because they deserve it. I'm not asking you to bless them and love them and serve them because they've earned it. I'm asking you to submit to their needs, to bless them, to serve them, because that's what Christ did for us. Paul says, I want you to absorb the love and grace of Christ into your heart, and then I want you to pour it out to the people in your life that you are closest to. Let me try to explain it this way. Imagine that I go to McDonald's for lunch and I end up standing in line directly behind you, and we greet each other and say hi, and you go to pay for your lunch and discover that you're about $1 short for what you need to pay for your lunch. So I reach into my pocket and I take out $1 and I give it to the cashier to make up the difference, and you say thanks and we part ways. And then let's suppose a few days after that, let's say, Wednesday, I win $2 million in the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. $2 million. And then I see you the next day, let's say on Thursday, I run into you and I say, hey, did you hear the news? Did you see me on TV last night with the big cardboard check? I won $2 million in the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. And then I say this, by the way, do you have that buck you owe me from Sunday? Now, would that seem ridiculous? I think it would. I wonder sometimes if it seems ridiculous to God that he has poured out so much of his love and his forgiveness and his grace upon us, and then we are unwilling to give even a percentage of that to the people around us. And Paul writes this letter and he says, listen, you need to submit to one another, not because they deserve it or they can earn it, but because out of reverence for Christ, because we follow a Savior who spent his entire life serving others, and then his life ended in the greatest act of servanthood that history has ever seen. So he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And my goodness, if you've ever seen a marriage where this exists, if you've ever seen a marriage where you've got two people who make love a verb, two people who just want to serve each other, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. I'll give you an example of this from the life of a man named E.V. Hill. E.V. Hill was a pastor. And when his wife was in her 50s, she died of cancer. And E.V. Hill spoke at her funeral service, at her memorial service. And in the message, he told a story about his wife and about how she served him in a way that he never forgot. It was early in their marriage and early in his career as a pastor when he came home one evening and his wife had turned off all the lights were out, and she had prepared a candlelight dinner for him. Let me tell you the rest of the story in his own words. He said this, she forgot to put a candle in the bathroom, and I went in the bathroom and turned on the switch, but no light came on. I went in the bedroom and hit the switch, and no light came on. Then I walked back out to the kitchen and sat down and said, baby, did they cut the power off? And she began to cry, and she said, you worked so hard, and you've been trying, but I didn't have quite enough to pay the light bill, and I didn't want you to know about it, so I thought we would just eat by candlelight. She could have said, I've never been in this situation before. I was reared in the home of a doctor, and we never had our lights cut off. She could have broken my spirit. She could have ruined me. She could have demoralized me. But instead, she said, somehow or another, we'll get these lights on. But let's eat by candlelight tonight. You see, his wife understood something about love, that real love requires action. That real love is a verb, that real life requires self-sacrifice. And when she could have complained, legitimately complained, instead she chose to encourage and she chose to bless. Jesus says, love one another. Here's how. As I have loved you. Paul says, submit to one another. Why? Out of reverence for Christ. If you want to stay in love, you got to make love a verb. Now, I want to make this very, very practical and very, very powerful. I want to turn that one big idea into a question. And if you are willing to ask this question in every relationship in your life, I believe it will revolutionize every relationship in your life. And here's the question, very simple question. How can I help you? Isn't that simple? Let's say this together at all three of our campuses. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. How can I help you? Let's do that again because the Wilkes-Barre campus was a little bit weak on that. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. How can I help you? Or you could say it this way, even more powerfully. How can I serve you? And this is a question we ought to be asking in our minds anytime we engage in a relationship. And we ought to have this mindset when we go into every relationship. How can I serve this person? But I want to encourage you not just to think this, but to actually ask this question. So here's the homework assignment for everybody from Parker Hill who's in church on this Mother's Day. The homework assignment is once a day, every day this week, find a way to ask this question, how can I help you? To your spouse, maybe to your kids. If you're not married, maybe to a roommate, to a coworker. How can I help you? How can I serve you? And by the way, middle school or high school students, we don't want to leave you out. I think you ought to ask this to your mom and dad because you won't even get an answer because they'll faint. They'll be on the floor. And you can go up to your room and you get credit for asking it, but you don't actually have to do anything. Or ask it when they have a group of friends over, ask it in front of all their friends. Mom, Dad, how can I help you? And they're going to say, oh, we're okay. And then you're going to go up to your room and all their friends are going to say, oh my goodness, show us how to parent. And then you'll get a new car. I mean, how can I help you? How can I help you? And the other person may say, well, I'm okay, but I really appreciate you asking. Or they might say, you know what, I could really use a listening ear. I just need some advice on something that's going on at work. Or they might say, you know what, I'm having a bad day. I just need some encouragement. Or it might be very practical. Unload the dishwasher. Or it might be spiritual. You know, I'd appreciate it if you would just pray for me. But see, here's what's most important is not the response. What's most important is what this question communicates. It says this, I care about you as a person. Your agenda is important to me. Your needs are important to me. And I want to elevate you in my life and make you important by asking how I can serve you. Now, here's what some of you might be thinking at this point in this message. Some of you might be thinking this. You might be thinking, well, Mark, it sounds good. It makes sense. And, you know, you're probably right. I really do need to make love more of a verb in my relationship. I should probably care more about serving my spouse. And I'm going to do that as soon as he does. I'm going to start doing that as soon as she does. As soon as he starts making the effort to meet my needs the way he's supposed to, he's not doing it, but as soon as he starts, then I'll maybe make the effort to meet his needs. As soon as she starts serving me, I'll start serving her. Do you know what that produces? A stalemate. That produces an impasse. It's kind of like, do you remember the story from Dr. Seuss of the north going Zacks and the south going Zacks? who were both making tracks in the prairie of Prax. And it happened that both of them came to a place where they bumped there. They stood foot to foot, face to face. You remember this story? Then the north-going Zacchaeus puffed his chest up with pride. I never, he said, take a step to one side, and I'll prove to you that I won't change my ways if I have to keep standing here 59 days. And I'll prove to you, yelled the south-going Zacchaeus, that I can stand here in the prairie of Prax for 59 years, for I live by a rule that I learned as a boy back in south-going school. Never budge. It's my rule. Never budge in the least. Not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. And then you get to the end of the story, the last page, and they've been standing there for so long, they built a highway over them, you know. But here's the thing, that's not just a Dr. Seuss story. I've seen that in real life. I've seen otherwise good marriages break down because the husband or the wife always has to have the last word or always has to make the final decision and will not serve the other person. I've seen friendships dissolve into pieces because one or both people refuse to admit that they were wrong. I know parents who will never admit to their kids when they've blown it and made a mistake, and they raise kids who are bitter and angry. I've seen churches fall to pieces because people refuse to give in on their personal agendas and be willing to serve others. Listen, if we're going to love each other as Christ loved us, we need the kind of love that initiates, the kind of love that serves, the kind of love that's willing to take the lower road. In fact, let me give you a principle that goes along with this question. When you least want to ask this question, that's when you need to ask it the most. When you least want to ask that question, that's when you need to ask it the most. So Jesus says, listen, love one another, and here's how: as I have loved you. Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. See, that's how you stay in love. And I'm telling you, this is a game changer. This is a life changer. This is a relationship saver. You just ask this one simple question. And by the way, if you're dating somebody who doesn't get this, be very careful. If you're engaged to somebody who doesn't get this, you better rethink that. If you're married to somebody who doesn't get this, model it. Show them what it looks like. Now, let me address 4 objections as I talk about this, as I talk about loving with the spirit of a servant, as I talk about making love a verb, as I talk about asking this question, how can I serve you? How can I help you? Here's the first objection. If I do this, they might take advantage of me, and they might. But if they do, you'll be in good company because they took advantage of Jesus too. And he washed their feet, and he continued to show them unconditional love, and he went to a cross and he died for them. But more likely what will happen, because I've seen this over and over again, more likely what will happen is that you will have influence, because there's nothing like humility and love and servanthood to melt the heart of another person. So yeah, they might take advantage of you, but I'll bet it won't last for very long. Here's the second objection. Second objection is this: I don't see how this would make me happy in my marriage. And this is not a cure-all, but I will say this: sometimes we don't really understand where happiness and joy come from, because it comes from things that sometimes are very countercultural and very counterintuitive. And let me tell you this: when it comes to relationships, you won't find happiness by trying to control another person. You'll find happiness, you'll find joy by blessing another person and serving another person. I mean, think about it. The most joyful person who ever lived was Jesus himself. And he spent his entire life serving other people. And his life ended in the greatest act of servanthood that history has ever seen. And by the way, this is kind of connected to this about happiness in marriage, because you may feel like, this sounds very, driven by obligation and duty. What about the romance? What about the feeling? What about the emotion? Listen, when you act lovingly, loving feelings will be reignited. It will follow. See, actions always drive feelings. And let me put it this way, and just keep this in the room between us, okay? The more you make love a verb, the more you'll make love. Okay, so let me just leave it at that, okay? When you decide to do this, it'll change the relationship. It'll bring the romance back. Here's the third objection. If I do this, it will feel awkward. Yes, it will, for a little while. And then you'll get used to it. It'll become part of your vocabulary. It'll become part of the fabric of the relationship, and it will change it. Last objection is this. If I do this, they might not take me seriously. And that's true. He or she may roll his or her eyes and be cynical, and it may take a while to break down that cynicism. It's kind of like the story of a guy who decided he really needed to put more effort into his marriage. He really wanted to serve his wife. And so he comes home one day after work with some flowers, and he gives his wife these flowers, and he gives her a big hug, and he says to her, I just want you to know that I'm the luckiest guy in the world to have you for a wife. And she just started crying. And through the tears, or he was confused by this, the husband, of course, they're always confused by tears. And he said, honey, what in the world is wrong? And she said, through her tears, she said this, she said, oh, it's been a terrible day. Billy got into a fight at school. The washer overflowed and flooded the basement. The car broke down. And now you come home drunk. Yeah, they may not take it seriously at first. They may be a little bit suspicious, but do it anyway. Make love a verb. And this week, every day, just say to somebody, how can I help you? How can I serve you? Because let me tell you what's really at stake in this, because I think this is bigger than all of us. What's at stake in this is we can show a watching world the heart of God in our family relationships. See, if there's ever been a trend that our culture would like to break, it's the trend of broken homes and dysfunctional families. And when they see something different in us, they're going to be drawn to that. They're going to be drawn to that kind of love, and they're going to be drawn to the giver of that love. And if we can learn to live this way and to love this way, I believe it has an impact not just in our relationships, not just in our families. I believe it'll have an impact in our community as people see a glimpse of the heart of God toward them. So that's your assignment. How can I help you?